Recording.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead. Welcome, Araya. Please take it away.
Thank you, Nana. I am Mariah Lester, and I am here to present Do Trans Lives Matter with your organization. This is the first time that I'll be presenting to an actual board, besides some boards that I have sat on a national and at a local basis in South Florida. Um, After I reviewed this presentation, so as a kind of little thing, I would like to say that there are some. This was the presentation that I put in here. I did update some slides, but I grabbed the wrong presentation, which has a few errors when it comes to um, the grammatical portions of how to use the term transgender. And I'm actually glad that it is in there because that is a conversation piece that we are going to have. And as individuals that have some history and experience in dealing with the community, I think that is a good topic to talk about. So this won't be your typical, trans competency 101 training. And I've tried to collect a lot of different points and facts that you may not have heard of in every other trans 101 that you have experienced before. So thank you all for sharing your time with me today. And as we begin, the first slide, what we're going to go into is what is transgender as far as what the term means. Now, Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines transgender as of, relating to, or being a person who identifies with or expresses a gender identity that differs from the one that corresponds to the person's sex at birth. Now, as you see, this is kind of a clinical definition, but it is a clinical definition because it is a governmental term. Transgender, basically, what this definition is telling us is that it encompasses every identity that doesn't fall under whatever gender societal norms that you live under in your country. So here in the United States of America, we currently live under a gender binary system, meaning that most of our governmental agencies, our society, publicly, privately, all kind of assume that there are only two genders, male and female, and only those two boxes. And any person's identity that does not match up with that is transgender. So we find transgender being an umbrella term, meaning that so many different identities, so many different lives, and so many different ways of existing are underneath this one term, that it is an umbrella term. And so when we come to trying to educate ourselves on the transgender community, we have to look beyond just male to female transsexuals, female to male transsexuals. And we need to look at a broader sense of community where you have people that identify as genderqueer, which is not unlike the sexual orientation queer, and that you don't want to be pigeonholed into any type of category. You have a lot of other terms for those of you that deal with other cultures, especially outside in other countries. You have terms such as the hijras in India. You have terms that may not be used here in America and may even be a pejorative term, but other countries actually take it, such as ladyboys in South Asia. And you have a lot of terms that all kind of correspond to a person whose identity doesn't match the identity that they were given based on their sexual organs at birth. Now, if you are a person who actually identifies with that sex which your doctors and your parents assigned you at birth, then that term is called cisgender. So if you see the term cisgender, it's not a term of hate, it's not a term of anything but meaning the opposite of transgender. So a person that identifies with their sex at birth, cisgender. a person who does not identify with what they were given at birth, transgender. Now, when we think about pronouns for different trans individuals, if you see on the next page, these are examples of different pronouns. Now, we talked about the transgender umbrella, and being that that umbrella exists outside of the gender binary and exists outside of our language that kind of identifies masculine and feminine when it comes to pronouns. However, our language has came to the 21st century, and we have many different options for pronouns. Now, I would like to point out the difference between saying preferred pronouns versus actual pronouns. We kind of want to stay away from it, especially being an organization that is LGBT and minority centered. We want to stay away from using the term preferred pronouns. And that's because it kind of gives the connotation that, okay, these are the pronouns that you would like for us to use for you, but not necessarily your real pronouns. And we don't want to ever give that impression to anyone that is a part of any transgender community. So we just want to use pronouns, period. My pronouns are she, her, hers. They're not preferred over anything else. They just are. Those are my actual pronouns. And we see here in examples of some pronouns, and some of which you may not have heard of, but you may hear of it through your client interaction. So I thought that it would be very important to kind of give you some of these pronouns and some of these examples. This is taken from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and it is a very good chart that you'll be able to use in your client interaction from this point onward. At this point, I want to take a little pause and see if anyone has any questions so far.
Do you know, how do you pronounce some of these? Like, some of them I've seen before, but some I haven't. And are they different, the ones?
Well, I do know that the last two, like Z, they, and Z, kind of sound alike, but as far as, yeah, those are the two that you're probably having issues with, and they kind of sound alike, but it is different when you go into the other tenses of that pronoun, as you can see. Any other questions on pronouns or how to use them? I do want to point out that if you have any questions about pronouns, first, you know that there's a lot there, exactly, a lot of pronouns, and there's a lot that's new, but you don't have to study them, not at all. You don't have to memorize them. All you have to do is be willing and able to ask every single person that you encounter, what are your pronouns? Don't save that question for only if someone is visibly trans to you. You want to use that as I give, as I tell other people, such as physicians, use this for every person that walks through your door. Don't try to assume, okay, let me ask for pronouns because it looks like this person might be trans or that this person is trans. Use it for everyone. You can't make any assumptions as far as physical appearance as to how a person identifies. And that person may not even be expressing their true identity to you at that point in time for many different reasons. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And this is a little thing that GLAAD did that was called hashtag Did You Just Say That? And these are examples of microaggressions. Now, does everyone know what microaggressions are? I'm sure we do in dealing with minority communities and oppressed communities as well. But you may be surprised to see the framework as to what microaggressions can sound like when it comes to addressing a member of the transgender or gender nonconforming community. We have some examples here such as, did you have the surgery? Anyone can tell me why that might be offensive? You are so beautiful for a trans girl.
I think the surgery question could be offensive for a lot of reasons. One is like there's assumption that there's like one surgery. Another is that like there's a surgery that has to happen in order for somebody to express their gender expression and identity. And another is like just that it's like nobody's business anyway.
Exactly. And we have to think, even when we talk about our good friends or our Judys or our co-workers, asking anything about surgery when it comes to a trans or gender nonconforming person basically is all falls down into the same question, what's between your legs? And we don't go around asking other people that, you don't go around asking anyone really about their private parts or their genitals and how they're structured and how they look. If we went to your everyday person and had those questions, we would be looked at as being a disrespectful person. So we don't want to do that with the trans community as well. We have some other examples here. You have to excuse me, my eyesight. Wow, I would have never known you used to be a girl. Sounds like a compliment, right? It could be. It could sound like a compliment. However, this is not a compliment. This is a microaggression. Are hormones going to change your voice too? Now that was just shade. So when are you going to really transition? Now that's a heavy loaded
That's pretty
one.
shady.
Mm-hmm. And like we said, there are different levels of transitioning, and there's no end point for any person when it comes to transitioning. A person can look like Jacob does there and yet identify and be fully done with their transition. And that's up to every single person, and it's not up to us to actually judge where a transition is supposed to be.
Right.
Yes, Nana, that's a good one. Your English, yeah, your English is so good. That's kind of similar to the one I would have never known that you were a girl. And then another one is, well, you understand what it's like to be a woman, and this is directed at a trans man.
Right. Yeah.
Even though that may be the truth. Just like I, at one time, had known what it's like to exist in society as a cisgendered male. But hearing that, especially from someone from the cisgendered population, is a microaggression. So we want to be really careful with how we talk to anyone, not just a person in the trans community. And like Nana had given the example of, from someone who English is not their first language, from someone who may be an immigrant from another country, to someone who has a different type of culture or different way of speaking than other people do. It's just the things that we need to keep in mind, but especially on this topic of gender identity, we want to keep those in mind as well and not have anyone actually come at us to say, did you just say that? Now, what I'm going to go into is just a little bit of scientific knowledge. Sequential hermaphroditism is a scientific term. Even though we don't use the term hermaphrodite when it comes to human beings, we still use it when it comes to other species of animals. And as you see, an example that you can always research later is the ribbon eel. And the ribbon eel is able to change its birth, sex. And for example, the male is all black. And if that male eel, ribbon eel would have to change his sex because of the environment, it will not only change its sexual organs, but the ribbon eel will also change its color as well, which I find to be very beautiful, and kind of envelops the metamorphosis of a caterpillar to the chrysalis to the butterfly, but in an aquatic type of sense. That kind of gives a good theme to what transition and gender transition truly means when we look at it in its whole totality and not just look at it through our human-like society. Another example is clownfish, which we see on the next slide. Clownfish are, they run in schools, and each school is ran by an alpha female, and she's the biggest fish that's in the school. Now, let's say that alpha female was to lose her life because of predation or old age or disease. What would happen is there is a beta male, and that beta male is usually the mate to the alpha female. And the beta male will actually change his gender to female in order to become the next leader and the next alpha for the clownfish. These are, you can go ahead to the next one. Another one is reef fish, and you can always research these two. I do want to, before we go to the next slide, ask a question. This is a slide that I had in the other presentation, but it didn't make it into this one. Does anyone know any type of trans-related info on Botswanan lions? Anyone heard of the lions in Botswana? Okay, well, that's another good one that you could always look up and read. Scientists have found that in the area of Botswana in Africa, there are a few numbers of lionesses, lions that were born female, that actually started growing manes like the male lions, and then their behavior actually were starting to exhibit the behavior of male lions, such as patrolling the territory, making sure no other male lions was to come upon the territory. And so not only did they physically start showing a gender trait that is not associated with female lions, but they also, their behaviors were different as well. And there's ongoing research with that. Okay, so here we see some of those terms that I were talking about, like the hedra, the ladyboy, pre and post-op. Femme queen is something that you hear in the ballroom communities. Transsexual is a specific transgender term that actually means someone who is transitioning from one side of the gender spectrum all the way to the other side by the means of medical and surgical interventions. So we have to point out that that is a kind of view that we see in transgender period, people being, especially when we just see the options for M to F or for F to M, but that's only for a specific population under the transgender umbrella. I do want to point out drag queen and drag kings. People in drag do not equate to being trans. In the same way that a square is not a rectangle, but a rectangle can be a square. And how that rectangle can be a square in this term may be a drag queen or a drag queen that uses that persona in order to publicly show their internal true identity, but not able to do so on other terms. But you may have people that are just entertainers that enjoy dressing up. These individuals would not be trans, because trans means internally what your identity is, which may encompass some drag queens and drag kings, but we can't lump all of them under the trans umbrella. Then transvestite and Bradacci are both terms that we don't use anymore, and those are terms that we want to stay away from that are antiquated. Now Native Americans use the term two-spirited, but this was an old term that was related to the same population.
I want to add, if I can.
Yes.
that in our community, the transgender community, a lot of the word transsexual is being used a lot as a way to move from the transgender term because of how encompassing it is, and by some of us has been used to like be like, no, I'm not trans, I'm a woman, like I'm not even transgender, I'm a woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even without medical intervention. Like those are just some of the conversations that I've been a part of.
Yes, thank you for that. And I'm gonna just skip. I had a little slide where I talk a little bit more about myself, but just to chime in with what Tiami just mentioned, even me being a trans woman of color, there was at one point in time where um, one I didn't believe that there were good trans people. And this was during the time when Jerry Springer was out in the late 90s. And so I was trying to look at who I was and finding examples, especially in the public media. And everything that I saw that was labeled transgender and transsexual was very negative. And I said, that's not me. So therefore, I must not be one of those people, even though I truly was. Not in that sense of being a person that should be on Jerry Springer, but in being an actual trans person. Then after that, when I actually started transitioning, it was all about, no, I'm a woman, I'm not trans. Or, I'm a femme queen, if anything, but I didn't identify with trans. Then we came into the 2000s and in the 20 teens to where we found that as a community that we have to be more public and more visible when it comes to our identities. And that was when I fully adopted the term transgender and started using that term in relation to me. Even though I still said that I was part of the transgender community, I never used that term specifically to me. So this is just to show that you may encounter people that are on different steps of that whole level that I just showed me myself have lived within my timeline. So you will find people identifying with different terms under that trans umbrella. Even the same person may identify as one way one week and one way the other week. It has nothing to do with about being fickle. It has to do with just us being complex human beings. So we have to keep that in mind as well. Now, gender diversity within our human history. History of trans subjects has been something that has been pretty much erased when it comes to our history books, when it comes to when we learn about other cultures in our society. So just a brief breakdown on that. We have the Hedras. There was a story of if we go to the next slide there, of Bahatra Mata, who was a person very revered in Buddhist culture, who was leaving a town, leaving a village. And as they left, they turned around and all of the villagers, all of the people were all gathered at the gates outside of the village. And they were like, Bahatra Mata, we don't want you to leave. We don't want you to leave. Please don't leave us. And he told them, you know what, go back into the city. Go back in and wait for me. Every man and woman go into the city and wait for me. And left. And went off on a journey, and I don't remember how long it was, but it was quite some time, maybe even a couple of years. And when they came back, the trans people were outside of the city because they said, Lord Bahatra, you said every man, every woman. We are neither man nor woman. And so we waited for you outside the city. So it just is just a little story that shows that many religions, even though they may not be present or popular stories today, do have a lot of trans history within them. On the next slide, you see an example from the Two-Spirited. For the Two-Spirit is actually an individual within a lot of Native American cultures that embodies both the female and the male spirit within one embodiment. And so therefore this person is not half and half or anything like that. They're one in one within one, you know, and so therefore they were revered and thought as being more gifted and more knowledgeable. And so when you needed to, for example, know your spirit name, you was to go to someone that was two-spirited because they had more knowledge and wisdom in having two spirits within their body, you know, and something that was above and beyond what your everyday person embodies within their culture. And so we do have some historical things going even all the way back. On the next slide, you see Pharaoh, let me say this right, Hatshepsut, who has a documentary, I believe, through PBS. If we go to the next slide, we see a picture of Pharaoh Hatshepsut, who was born female, but ruled a dynasty in Egypt as a male, using male regalia, such as this false beard that you see in the picture. In the next slide, we see Roman Emperor Elagabalus, who was one of the first people to sanction SRS, or sexual reassignment surgery research, or gender confirmation surgery research, who kind of went by the name of Queen of Heracles. And Heracles was Emperor Elagabalus's lover, someone who was a cisgendered male, and so Elagabalus wanted to rule as a full-on female, and so put out a cash reward for any physician within the Roman Empire that was able to finalize and give him sexual reassignment surgery, which did not happen. Another example from France during the 18th century is the Chevalier d'Eon, who was a spy and a diplomat who started going against the gender conformity as a spy, but then also continued to live their life that way. And then just the next slide is another individual called Heinrich Ulrich, who is not a trans or gender nonconforming person, but who coined a lot of the terms that we use within our transgender community and within our LGBT community as a whole as well. So these are just a few things that you can always research on your own time if you find it more interesting, like I did. Now we have some examples we see here. Oh, you see that mistake over on the side, modern transgenders? I'm going to get into that. For example, we see one person that is a trans woman, and then we see a person that is not a trans woman, even though the person that is not is someone who is more stereotypically given off the persona of a woman. Now, transgender is a term that is an adjective. I am a transgender woman of color. I am a woman of trans experience. I am not a transgender. Although at one time, we did use the term as a noun and as an adjective. And I believe in the dictionary, it was as a noun and as an adjective. But in our politically correct society now, we have kind of moved to where the term transgender is an adjective. So I would like for you to, in your professional environments and circles, to use that term as an adjective. So this would actually say modern transgender individuals, modern transgender people, where transgender is an adjective just as modern is, and I wouldn't call them transgender moderns, you know. So that just makes it a little bit easier to just all across the board use it as an adjective, but also keep in mind that you may come across some trans individuals that do use it as a noun, and you don't want to really correct them because that's how it was before you even knew about the term anyway. So I do want to kind of point it out that even from trans community members, you will hear different uses of that term. And also when it comes to translating from other languages as well, such as Spanish or Filipino, it may come out as a noun and that is okay because of that translation from that language to where it is used as a noun. So I know that this kind of puts a lot of people up in arms, but we do want to know all the ways in which people use this term so that we can be better educated. And on the next slide, we see Laverne Cox and Chaz Bono, another example of transgender individuals. Now, some trans issues is the next slide. These are some, we did a survey in South Florida in 2012 for the National HIV and AIDS strategy out of the White House. And what we found within that listening tour of our population, and what we have also found through other surveys, such as the National Trans Survey through the National Center for Transgender Equality, and through the Transgender Law Center, that, and that's spelled so wrong. Cultural competency is something that is needed within organizations that are catered to or have services that are used by transgender community members. We need to understand the difference between gender identity and sexual preference. It's really easy. One's external and one's internal. Sexual preference or sexual orientation is who we are attracted to. That's outside of me. That's me outward, who I am looking at, who I am attracted to. Gender identity is who I am internally. So there's two very clear different things, even though you see LGBT, lesbian sex, gay sex, bisexual sex, transgender identity, and so this has led to a lot of confusion for people outside of LGBT circles, but it's something that we have to continuously push because it just is the way that it is right now and what we're dealing with. Access to jobs and training is something that is important. A lot of LGBT organizations only think about hiring a trans person when they have trans grant money. And that's something that needs to change because trans people are something far beyond just who we are, but we're also what we're able to do. And what we're able to do extends far beyond what our identities are. Just like it's beyond me being a Black woman, far beyond me being an American woman. We have skill sets when it comes to jobs, particularly, that go beyond our identities. And so as organizations, we have to think about giving access beyond our target populations. Community involvement is something that is an issue, and this is an issue for the trans community in of itself. It could be being jaded from different programs that use the trans community, that brought them in and got numbers and got thousands of dollars, and all the trans community got was a Walgreens gift card. And so community involvement is something that organizations have to actually take the fault on in our past and how we have treated our community members. And so you can't really get mad when you have a trans program and you're not getting too much attendance, because you have to look at the history of the trans community and how they have been used and tokenized in so many years through all of the so-called LGBT movement work that has happened. Empowerment to manage HIV care. That's self-explanatory. Prevention and education at an early age. We have no problems as parents or godparents or aunts and uncles telling our kids the difference between boys and girls, but yet we find that a person has to be mature to handle and learning about a trans person or a trans person's life. And that's something that needs to change as well. We need to address stigma and ostracism. And we need to be, this last point is when it comes to data and research. In data and research, we need to be defined as a population separate from the men who have sex with men or gay category. Because as we have seen in the CDC, except for in recent years, for many years, there was no real money that was going towards such a highly underserved and highly infected and affected population. And that was because our data numbers were pulled into the MSM numbers. And so therefore, being that organizations and programs got more gay identified individuals to come to services because they were more culturally competent in giving those services to them, the trans people were kind of left out of services. So we need separate data in order to have separate programs, because we need programs to be specified to us and our gender identities and not on our sex or the sex that we have. And I mean sex like sex. If just to be make it clear. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any other questions from the group. Questions or comments or anything you would like to add, or any objections as well. Thank you. Thank you both. That's good to hear. Let me just do like a quick canvas. Is there anyone that hasn't learned anything new yet? It's okay to say so. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. And this is an old piece of research. I do encourage you to, if you're on my Facebook page, I've posted it just this week. There's a new study that kind of affirms this study back in the Netherlands in 2011. And what they found was that there is a differing amount of white and gray matter within the brains. And for example, they did a study, if you see on the next slide, and the chart is really easy to read. You see the first column is a cisgender male. Second column is a homosexual or gay male. The third column are females, and the last column are females of trans experience. So we see there, when you look at the number of the neurons in the limbic nucleus, you see that is similar when it comes to cisgender males and cisgender males who have the sexual orientation of being attracted to other males. That data set that I told you that they always lump us in with. Then you see cisgender females and you see trans females, and you see that they have similar numbers of neurons in their limbic nucleus as well. And I do want to point out as well that the trans females in the last column are also ones that this has nothing to do with hormone replacement therapy either. This has to do simply with identity and nothing to do with any type of hormone replacement. Yes, it is. And there's a new study that just came out. You can share it with your networks as well.
I saw that the new study, they were looking at, it was children, right? Like before there would have been any kind of,
yes, exactly.
Potentially any kind of hormone therapy.
And so I'm sure you all have kind of noticed, because everyone's extremely smart on this call, that this is all just kind of setting up on just how ludicrous it is in today's society that we have scientific evidence. We have evidence within the natural world outside of human society when we look at other species. We have evidence within our past and different cultures and societies that existed and had gender systems that were more than just two options. But yet, we are living and dealing right now with a society that doesn't understand trans people. So, it's just when you really look at it in the whole totality, it just is kind of crazy. But so now you have a few more talking points to kind of give people that kind of have no idea what this is all about, and so this is going to help you to become a better ally to our community and having just a bit more knowledge than you may have had before this webinar. Now, transgender mental health issues are on the next slide. I'm sure you all know about this, where we have high rates of depression, suicide, and anxiety. You may come across self-harming behavior if any of you do case management, or if any members of the Positive Women's Network has ever reached out to you for any type of counseling, even though you may not even really be a licensed counselor. Obsessive and compulsive behavior has been identified within mental health, especially compulsive cross-dressing. And that was what I had talked about earlier, where you have some people that do drag, and then you have some people that are compelled to do drag in certain situations because of their gender identity and having some form of gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria in of itself is a term dysphoria is a Greek term that literally means emotional distress. So gender dysphoria is a psychiatric term meaning emotional distress over your gender or over the gender that was assigned to you at birth. So the reasoning behind this designation is that, let's say, for example, I have anxiety over my gender, and so therefore the cure or the way to try to treat my gender dysphoria would be hormone replacement therapy, surgical interventions, mental health counseling, that type of thing. So it kind of makes it available to code and for insurance to cover certain things such as hormone replacement therapy and having an actual designation for it. That is soon changing, and there will have to be a national kind of talk on that, because, for example, you have a lot of trans individuals, especially our aging trans populations, that solely subsist and exist upon their Social Security benefits or SSI, and they may only get that because they have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So to talk about what happens to these individuals once we take off this distinction that people in the new generation are kind of seeing as something bad for our community, although it's, what's bad for some isn't bad for everyone. So keep a lookout on that.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit more why there are sort of different views on that language, that like having a medical diagnosis, it's basically like a diagnosis, right?
Yes.
That like facilitates access to certain services, but it's sort of like a stigmatizing diagnosis. Could you just like dive a little deeper on why there's...
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's very, very complicated. Like, for example, you get that diagnosis so that you can have access to prescriptions such as estrogen and testosterone that can be covered through insurance. So let's say if there wasn't that designation to have that diagnosis, then in order to get that hormone replacement therapy through your physician, you, for example, in the past, my physician had to put in my paperwork that I was a cisgender female so that the hormone replacement therapy could be covered under the same distinction as, say, menopause, because it's the same type of medication. But in being a trans person and going under any type of gender marker within your medical records, having the diagnosis of gender dysphoria gives you access to having your prescriptions paid for through either your insurance or through Medicaid or Medicare, or even through some Ryan White services as well. But then you have the other end of people saying that me being trans is not a diagnosis. It's not something that is mentally wrong with me. And so therefore that is another conversation, and that having this diagnosis of gender dysphoria is something that is harming the trans community, because it's buying into the public view that trans people are crazy, when it comes to their gender. So, there's pluses, and you can kind of see the viewpoints of both of those. And like I said, either way that decision goes affects people in positive matters and negative matters. So I really don't know what to say on that as far as a recommended decision that I would give the DSM, for what to have or what not to have and what to take out. Because, like I said, a lot of people are only paying their rent and getting their food by that designation of gender dysphoria.
Thank you.
Now, the next slide is not something I'm really going to get into, but you see a little bit of where I've been. Basically, around 1989 was when I moved to Georgia, and after that, I started. That's when I kind of knew 2 years before then that something was different with me, or that society viewed that something was wrong with me. It was in the 90s that I started to struggle myself with one of who I was attracted to. So I was struggling with my sexual orientation when it came to living in a small rural town of less than 20,000 people in the whole county. And to where of the whole LGBT community existed of only one gay couple, and that was it. And so there was no education. And so you may find people or encounter people that reach out to or are part of PWN that come from rural areas that have none of this education, even though they may identify as a person underneath the trans umbrella. I started going to college in 1997, had got a scholarship to Harvard, and also got a full scholarship to a private university closer to my parents, called Berry College. And so I went there and started transitioning and was put into conversion therapy because it was a private Christian college, which led to a suicide attempt, which led to me moving back to New York, to where that was the first time that I started to truly get at least some of this education that you have noticed in some of these slides before. And in 2005 was when I really started spearheading my work and being an advocate and educator for the trans community and for those servicing our community. I'm doing a time check real quick. Okay, we got a little bit of time to go into some client examples. You can go 2 slides ahead. This is an example of someone who started transitioning in high school, had no support, became homeless, and a runaway. We have high numbers of LGBTQ youth and of trans youth that are homeless. As I did when I was homeless as a teen, I started going towards prostitution, because this was a time, this was in the late 90s, to where there was no aspirations for a trans woman of color, even in Manhattan and New York. The most that we can really wish towards was to be a receptionist somewhere as a woman. And that was like, if one of us was to attain that, we was to get the platinum life achievement in just being a receptionist, just your entry level position. And so we found that prostitution, sex or sex work, or living as a dancer was our only means of survival. And so this example of Kimberly was someone who did that. but had a lot of negativity. You know, some sex work can be positive if you have a good environment for it. And some sex work, when you're kind of forced into it because of society, you really don't get into those good environments and you get into an environment of negativity just because you need funds to live. Kim saved enough money for body modification so that she can have her gender affirmation, and then finally was able to live her life as a woman and drew off her trans identity, and but only had her sex work history as experience. And so as this example, I know that some of you do work in different departments. Some of you may work with other agencies. What programs or services do you think might Kim have been able to go into when she was a youth in the second bullet point?
From what I've seen, like as a youth, we had to create our own agencies. We had to create our own because there was nothing available for a person that lived outside of those gender norms, male or female.
Does anybody have, like, let's say this person wants to call you right now after this webinar, where would you refer them to? Are there options in your area? Do you know of any options in your area?
In the Bay Area, we have Larkin Street Youth Services, which serves a lot of trans and LGBT youth who are homeless and marginally housed.
That's good.
Yeah.
Here in Arkansas, well, here in Little Rock, we have Lucy's Place that services LGBTQ youth who are homeless. And so in the year and a half that I've been gone, they went from just getting an establishment, well, a drop-in center, to actually having 2 homes now. Yeah.
But I would like to point
In
out.
DC, there's Casa Ruby.
Oh, yes, there is.
I'm sure they're in Miami. Well, we've got Ariana's. Ariana does a lot of work with that, and I know there's. I think there's at least one other organization that, but I'm not.
Yes,
I never leave my house in Miami, so.
Yes, it's based in Pride Lines, and they have an LGBT youth homeless program where they help individuals. But you know, I would like to point out that we're not really shouting out a whole lot because this is an issue nationwide when it comes to having services for youth, for trans youth in particular, for LGBT youth. You know, to get them at their most vulnerable stages, to where if we were able to intervene at that point in time of what change that we can have in really creating leaders for our communities. And so, you know, I would love for you to kind of look at what's available in your area. If a trans person was to come to you, would you know where to direct them to if they came to you at the second bullet point? If they came to you after she already had a history of sex work and was saving money in order to, you know, have some type of gender affirmation surgery. You know, we need to, and you might be surprised that you never maybe have even thought of what service. You know that the community's out there, you know the needs, but never really thought of where would I send them if they asked me. You know, and so I think that that's something that I would love for everyone to kind of think about in the following days, weeks, years, and lifetime. You can skip past the next 2. These are just other examples. Yeah, you can skip that as well, and you can skip that. So, best practices. So what do? We want to create a comfortable, inviting environment. How do we do that? 1, we don't assume anyone's gender identity, period. In not assuming anyone's gender identity, we won't address anyone by any type of pronouns until that person tells you what their pronouns are, or you ask them what their pronouns are and they tell you. Simple. Expanding EOC guidelines internally as an organization. The equal opportunity guidelines are something that is kind of basic. It doesn't really have gender expression in there. Look at those guidelines and look at your employee handbook. Do you actually have a addendum, to those guidelines that actually include specifically the transgender umbrella and people and how they identify and have protections for gender identity and for gender expression, which is something totally different that is more general, that is even outside of the transgender umbrella, because gender expression is something that a cisgender person can benefit from as well. Employing trans competent staff. Are we asking people before we, have them on our board or have them on our staff where their competency is, not only in dealing with minorities or dealing with women or dealing with people living with HIV, but in dealing with people who are transgender? And then education on the variety under the trans umbrella. Having a webinar such as this for every person that comes into your organization. Have someone new come in after this webinar, sit down and review this webinar with them, with someone that was on this call. We have to make sure that as our organization kind of changes, as people move out and move in, we need to make sure that everyone is educated on those same topics and not just say, hey, as an organization, we had this webinar and we're competent now. You are on your way to competency only at this specific moment right now. And you will continue to be on your way to competency for your organization's existence. Just like I am still being competent on my own community going forward as well, as evidenced by some of the wordage in these slides that at one time was okay for the general population, and right now some things aren't. Trans community, oh, there we go. And so that is it for me. And I will take any other questions or comments right now. Thank you.
We're good on time. So if there's anything else you wanted to say.
No, there wasn't. It's just that my thing that I'm looking over right here had a slide that's not in there. So I thought it was another one. Okay. So I'm ready for questions.
Well,
okay, so who feels, go ahead.
Like, this is my first time seeing you in your element. I know that you do great work, but like, thank you so much, Araya. Thank you.
Oh, so thank you, sis.
No, thank you. I'm just sitting here thinking, like, how is it that I was in front of you at Block? You know what I'm saying? Like,
you'll be surprised how many people know me and have never actually sat through one of my trainings before. So don't feel bad about that. It happens. Our lives just kind of, they intersect at the right time.
Right.
Araya, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the stuff on, kind of like competency in the workplace is really helpful. We also are an organization that hosts a lot of trainings, conferences, meetings. Can you share anything kind of around like best practices or what are some things like that you think organizations can do better?
Well, one thing that I can say, what was that?
Oh, what do you think organizations can do better around structuring spaces that are both cis and trans inclusive to be really truly trans inclusive?
Okay, let me start off from the baseline. The baseline would be what you're doing right now, right? But in order to give a little assistance in that. One, be aware that you can plug in competency training for your organization as a line item in just about every grant that I've looked at. Because when it comes to meeting deliverables in a lot of community work, LGBT work, HIV work, competency is something that you can build into that. So in order to have ongoing education, in order to, for example, have an update as far as like if any of these terms or definitions have changed, like let's say 2 or 5 years later, that you do have the capacity as an organization in order to get an expert, subject expert in the trans community to be able to give the training to your organization as it evolves and as it grows, and be able to adequately compensate that person as well. So keep that in mind going forward whenever you do any grant writing. Now, secondly, what we need to do is, one, for example, using gender neutral language when it comes to any of your paperwork. You saw that trans umbrella thing. So we want to, don't think that just because you have trans as a checkbox that that's good enough. A lot of organizations now are putting trans as no checkbox whatsoever. It's just a box where the person fills in what their gender is. Unless you work on a medical basis that specifically has to deal with hormonal imbalances or balances, and dealing with laboratory forms, you don't need to know what the sex of the person was assigned at birth. That's something that's not needed. Gender, and the gender that they identify with is enough for your research and for your numbers, unless you are specifically mandated by your grantor that you have to get that information. What you want to do for every client is to actually tell them before you ask that question, we're required to ask this because of where we get our funding from, and we are working to make this change. However, I need to ask, what was your sex assigned at birth? Even though that is not our policy as an organization, and we will continue to respect your actual gender. And so, that is an example of being welcoming and opening, but still requiring information that may be a bit tricky when it comes to paperwork. When it comes to just interaction with fellow board members, with PWM members, with clients, with anybody, neutral, 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 neutral. You never know who a person is when they walk through your door. You never know how a person identifies. You never know that somebody that you know for 10 years may have changed their identity internally with no type of external change. And then when it comes to, the name that you have, your name, not necessarily your birth name or your chosen name or the name you go by, just your name. Like, for example, many cisgender people hate their first name and always go by their middle name, and for that person, it may feel a bit wrong or disrespectful that they have to fill out paperwork and use a name that they hate, and that's something that's not altogether special just for the trans community. And none of these points that I'm saying is just good for the trans community. It's good for rapport with every person, because we're also complicated and we're also complex, that we don't want to box anyone within anything. So another thing that I would like for people to kind of, if you want to try to imagine, for example, how it is to be a trans person, what I usually do in my trainings where I'm face to face with you and we're kind of can go into small groups and whatnot, take out a piece of paper, write down, your name, the name that you go by, your name, and, your favorite color, your pronouns, blah, blah, blah. Then flip that paper over. If you're right-handed, use your left hand. If you're left-handed, use your right hand. Then I want you to write your birth name, the opposite pronouns than the pronouns that you actually are. You know, you've known all your life, basically, if you're cisgender, kind of like what you like, what type of clothing you like, what your identity is, what pronouns you go by. If you were altogether forced to use the different side of your brain that you never used before, for example, with your fingers, being trans is just as natural as knowing if you're right-handed or left-handed. And that's something that you need to keep in mind. And it's not something like, how do you know you're right-handed? You know, like that's the same thing of saying, how do you know that you're a woman? You know, it just is. And as we see with the scientific research, it just is, you know. And so, you know, think if everything that you are is someone tried to make that the opposite. And that's what it means and feels like in living life as a trans person in our general society. And so we want to be as opening and welcoming to every person as possible, because before they even got to you or walked through your door or decided to even press your name to send you a message on their phone or on their computer, they already went through a lot living in today's society. So we don't want to put anything else more on them.
Thank you. Other questions? Arnita, I think you're muted. I just heard something.
Yes, any other questions? Make sure you unmute yourself, or you can send in the chat as well.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know. Something funny has been going on with my microphone on my computer. But yeah, I was saying that this is awesome and thank you. I also want to know, and thank you for bringing up this idea of the transgender umbrella. And I wanted to know if you had any like guidance or resources that you could share with us as an organization with Positive Women's Network, and how to be more supportive of folks who identify along the spectrum under the umbrella. So in supporting trans women, but also folks who identify as trans masculine or gender nonconforming or non-binary folks. How do we also support them in our membership and in our programs?
Well, you should have to support them by, one, not singling them out. You know, you need to make sure that they're just like everyone else, you know, that you are recruiting. And if your recruitment, if you don't seem to be getting that feedback, then maybe you need to look at the way that recruitment is going on. You know, you may find when you really dig a little deeper that your recruitment may be also based on a gender binary system. You know, I'm not quite sure, but maybe you have to kind of look at that and see if it truly is neutral when it comes to asking questions on gender, or even just the framework and how the words are, you know, within, let's say, newsletters or whatnot. I'm not quite, I can't really give any examples, and it's nothing that really comes to my mind that PWN has done in relation to that. So I'm just saying, you know, maybe, you know, take a second look at it. You have, you know, trans people there, have them take a look at it, you know, have them look at some of the recruitment materials that you do have and ask if there's anything that may be offensive, or even, like we pointed out, a microaggression, which is something that could be very particularly hidden, you know, in a sense, and that we can kind of look over and not really notice until we get that subject expert to actually look at it. So I couldn't really say for sure, except to have all of your stuff pass by, you know, just like you'll have it pass by a group of women for anything that is catered, you know, towards that audience. You want to do the same thing for trans. And when we say women, we need to know that women means women of cis experience and women of trans experience. And if you just say women, and trans people, then that's still separating the two categories. But if you say women, both of trans experience and cis experience, is showing that, okay, we're not the binary type of folk where the one women just mean cis, but we are still welcoming, but we're also not separating you into your own table or circle within that environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know that like during our strategic planning process, we had a lot of conversations around, the best, and also we had a lot of conversations around it, and also just the question of, as a women's organization, obviously we're inclusive of trans women, but what the question is like, what about other people of trans experience or people who are not on the gender binary? And also, is it, it could be offensive to a trans man to be like inviting them into a women's organization because they don't identify as a woman. So yeah, and I feel like there have been a lot of different sort of opinions.
Are we recruiting? Are you recruiting trans men?
We're not specifically, no, but okay. I think the idea was like wanting to be inclusive of basically like if they wanted to be part of things, but then there's we have a lot of cis male allies too who participate in different ways and who support us. So, but they're not members of PWA.
I can see how that can be difficult, but you need to look at it also like you just put out there what is for, and whoever is for will come into it. If you try to think too much about, like, is this welcoming to this person, that person? Do they identify as this and that? You just need to be clear on your end as to who this is for, right? Like, let's say this is for women living with HIV and people who are allies to them. That in of itself, women of cis and trans experience living with HIV and their allies, that's everybody in of itself anyway, and so when a person comes in, you just don't want to assume how they are coming in. So just because a person is interested in an organization, maybe a trans man, may not necessarily mean that that person is a, identifies as such, so we just want to keep it general and open. And so that generality is actually the thing that you want to keep in mind. And yes, you will have some trans men, you will have non-binary people, because, for example, many have a lived experience that may be conducive or relatable to a lot of your mission objectives as an organization. So you need to keep in mind that your mission objectives may be beyond even what your demographics are really looking at in your head.
Yeah, following up on that, I kind of had a more specific question. So because most of our membership are women, both women of cis women and women of trans experience, I feel like they're very comfortable saying things, like it's so great working with you ladies and to be surrounded by all these powerful women. And because we do have some, non-binary transmasculine folks, I'm always wondering if I should say things like, hey, let's, make sure that we're not lumping everybody into the same group, because I feel like then it becomes a very specific, it draws attention to the folks in the group who are not women. So I'm wondering, like, what's the best way to navigate
Exactly like I said with the gender neutral language, you don't, not just in your forms, but in your delivery, in your approach, in your audiences, we want to use, thank you to all gathered here, or, you just want to use language that is not centered around gender at all. You don't want to even say ladies and gentlemen, because ladies and gentlemen leaves out the gender neutral and the gender queer, and those that that identify under all those other pronouns, and you saw there was more than just the she, he, and they. So there's a whole big population that you're leaving out, even if you say ladies and gentlemen. Get out of the gender binary. Leave two options alone. Leave all gender alone. Of course, that doesn't mean change your name or say you're not the Positive Women's Network, but just realize that when you're, that's the framework that you're given, that you're putting out there. So people already know that your work is for women, that is for women that are living with HIV, because that's plain in the name. So after that, all you need to do is keep it gender neutral so that you make sure that you respect any and everyone's identity.
So it's okay for me to kind of correct folks and remind them to use gender neutral language. That's not kind of like singling out folks in the group, right? For me to
Well,
do.
yes, I would do so, because when someone is kind of called out in a good, positive sense, in order to be able to call them back in, then that person, it sinks a lot better in their head in order to remember it in every interaction from that point onward. But if you kind of leave it, just say, oh, well, and then maybe talk to another person about it, when the education isn't happening.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
To sort of just piggyback, well, not piggyback, but I guess like kind of a follow-up question of that is, I mean, would you want to actually do that in the moment, or is that a conversation you have later offline? Because it seems like if you do it in the moment, you might just be drawing more attention inadvertently. I mean, it might make total sense if there's like, cis men in the room or something, but if you're trying to avoid any particular person in the room feeling singled out, then if you call someone out on saying, welcome women or whatever, then it seems like if you do it in the moment, you might just be drawing more attention.
Well, that's why I said call out with the intentions of calling in. So let's say, for example, for me, I heard that it was the greeting, it was the beginning. I'm not going to get up right then and there. I will make sure that the next time that that person is able to comment or ask a question, I'll raise my hand, and then, I'll address everyone, and I'll say, gathered people here, I want to be gender neutral in order to respect everyone's identity, and then say my little comment or question that has to exactly do with whatever was talked about. It doesn't need to be, I don't think that they were actually saying right then and there at the moment, but I believe the question, if I'm not mistaken, was to let it go or not, and not bring it up at all, or to say something. But I'm sure that you can all decide of the manner in which you can say that so that it's not disruptive. So any other questions or comments? I hope you all enjoyed this.
Yeah, if there are no other questions or comments, I just want to really thank you, Araya. This has been incredible. I know I learned a lot, and also really appreciate your presentation and facilitation style. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I apologize. Paul gave us the day off, so I have no makeup on, which is like uncharacteristic of being, I forgot it was Zoom. For some reason, I was thinking we were just audio, but here I am, and thank you.
Well, I have a quick question. Sorry, I'm fascinated by the picture on this slide. What is that?
It's beautiful.
That's another topic. I'm also a fiction writer. I have some scholarly published articles out there, but I'm also a fiction writer. This scene kind of represents a country within this fantasy world that I created. And so, and with a lot of like transitioning and trans and gender topics and religion and that type of stuff.
It's really cool.
Thank you. And it's not mine. I didn't make the picture.
I was gonna ask.
It's beautiful.
Really beautiful.
Yeah.
Let us know where we can read your fiction.
Yeah.
I can always send you a copy. I have publishers looking at it, but I can always send you a PDF if you're interested.
Oh no, economic justice. Make us buy it.
Right. Right.
Let's wait till it comes out.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and hope you have a great holiday weekend. Thanks for doing
You
this.
too. You too. Happy Memorial Day weekend.
Yes.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Love you.
Care.
Bye.
Love you.